I would like to talk about the rising problem of refugees, and in particular, how statisticians can help with what I think is going to become an emergent crisis. I'd like to talk first about the 2050 problem. Demographers say that in 2050, the world population will peak somewhere between 9.8 and 10.2 billion human beings. And we already have a population over 8 billion. So most of those 9.8 to 10.2 billion people are already here. Uh, there is some variation, but most researchers say that the carrying capacity of the planet with anything like a middle-class Western lifestyle is somewhere between 1.1 billion and 1.5 billion. The numbers can change a little bit if everybody becomes a vegetarian or other things change, but basically, we're going to have an overpopulation problem. Uh, this is a slow-moving crisis, but our students are going to be at their career maturity when this all comes down. And so the students I've been teaching for the last 10 years, they're going to be in highly placed positions. Uh, and sorry, Duke University is going to have students who are going to be advisors in the White House. They're going to be people at Duke who are going to be working for the World Health Organization, the United Nations. They're going to be students at Duke that I've taught who are going to be vice presidents of multinational corporations, and they're going to be making critical decisions about how to handle this overpopulation problem. It's confounded with climate. Climate forecasting is less accurate than demography, but the climate scientists say that in 2050, North Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia will regularly experience prolonged periods with temperatures uh, greater than 120 degrees in Fahrenheit or 49 degrees in centigrade. I was talking with a friend at the Chennai Math Institute, and uh, last year, they had a month in which the temperatures were over 49 degrees every day. And that's really not survivable unless you have access to advanced technology and lots of potable water. And that situation is going to force population displacement, leading to increased numbers of refugees. Uh, Bangladesh is going to be underwater. It's going to have to move north into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I don't imagine that that's going to go very, very smoothly. Uh, to exacerbate the global warming problem, we should recognize that there is no nation in the world that has the political will to leave coal unburned in the ground when it's 49 degrees outside and you need to run a desalinization plant. Uh, so I think that we're probably going to burn through a lot of non-renewable resources over the next 30 years. Uh, I'm afraid the situation is probably inevitable and it's going to test the world, and we're not going to rise to the occasion very well. But early action may provide some amelioration, and I think data scientists and statisticians have a role to play. Um, Given these circumstances, I expect an increasing number of refugee camps. And if you are a statistician or an econometrician, you can help to measure the economic needs of an efficient refugee camp. How much money do you need to support a certain number of people? If you are a public health statistician, uh, a refugee camp manager needs to know how many people in the camp are pregnant, how many people in the camp have diabetes. Um, if you receive money from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, then you are obliged to provide education for the children in the camp. And that means you have uh, uh, information needs rather like a school service. You have to track students' educational progress. So a school board has a whole batch of education needs, and that's going to be part of the reporting that one does. Unfortunately, refugee camps are generally not safe places. There's high levels of crime. So you need to collect statistics on crime in order to decide whether or not you have an appropriate degree of uh, policing to ensure stability. And also you need to track methods for finding permanent residency for people in your refugee camp. Conditions vary from country to country and even within countries, but forward planning is going to be helpful in trying to improve the situation. Uh, Duke University has a program called Bass Connections, and it provides funding for courses that are aimed at social good. And so last semester, I worked with 22 students to study refugee camp management practices. Is there a question, Okafor? No? Okay. Um, so one component of this project is the seed money I got from Duke University, which I used to bring in speakers from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and other groups. Uh, and we also held a conference last spring in which the president of the ISI gave the opening address, the International Statistical Institute, uh, and then there were a number of other speakers. Uh, Another component of this is the American Statistical Association. It has a group called Statisticians Without Borders, and they are involved. Dr. Sima Ayer at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is also working with us. She runs the Hive, which is the main UNHCR data repository. And it turns out that the Hive is basically a mess. If you receive money from UNHCR, you are required to produce an annual report, but there's no standard format for that report. And so information is scattered through the reports in many different ways, and it's hard to extract. Uh, uh, Three of my students worked with the UNHCR's Hive to use uh, large language models to extract standardized information from these reports that were submitted. I have questions about the quality of the data that are contained in these reports, but that's a secondary issue. One clear contribution that data scientists can make is to help the UNHCR better manage the data reporting that it receives. Finally, I was at the International Statistics Institute's World Statistics Congress 2 weeks ago, and I met with their new leaders of a Data for Good program, and these people are excited about cooperating with a data science for refugee camp management initiative. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on in the talk. But in any case, the main message is we've got three moving parts going forward. We've got the American Statistical Association, which can contribute volunteer expertise. We've got the International Statistics Institute, which can give us connections internationally to statisticians in basically almost all the countries in the world. And then we have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And I hope that we can put together sort of a machine that draws on these three entities to produce better refugee camp management through better statistics. Last year, the Bass Connection program required that we focus on refugees in the Middle East and Northern Africa. So here is one map that sort of shows what's going on. The red triangles correspond to refugee camps for Syrian refugees. The blue squares correspond to Syrian refugees that are generally not in camps. You'll see a batch concentrated in Turkey. You'll see a batch over in Iraq. You see some in Jordan. Lebanon is not using a camp model. They're using a decentralized model. So the refugees are generally living in cities rather than camps. And we're going to see that different countries are handling refugee crises in different ways. Jumping back to the 2050 problem in climate change, many people don't realize, but the Syrian refugee crisis had a climate trigger. There's a 10-year drought that drove the Syrian farmers off the farms and into the cities, where they expected economic opportunities to arise. But those economic opportunities were not forthcoming, which led to dissatisfaction, leading to an attempt to replace the government, and then everything went sideways after that. Here are some of the refugee routes. Uh, you'll see that there's a batch of refugees from Southeastern Asia that are trying to get to Australia. Australia has had very bad refugee practices. Uh, I think they're beginning to turn the corner on that. You see a whole batch of refugees from Africa who are trying to basically get into Europe. You have the Syrian refugees who are also trying to get into Europe. And then you have refugees from Latin America that would like to go to North America. So let's talk a little bit about refugees and asylum seekers. Uh, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is based on two legal documents. The 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee and outlines the rights of refugees and the legal obligations that states have to protect them. Uh, in particular, there's the non-refoulement principle, which says that a refugee cannot be returned to their original country if their life or freedom would be at risk. Uh, the second document is the UNHCR Statute of 1950, which defines the functions of the High Commissioner. And the agency's work initially focused on Europeans who were uprooted during World War II, and that causes some problems. We'll see that when we talk about Turkey. But many countries, such as Saudi Arabia, are not signatories to these agreements, although they do contribute to the refugee support in other ways. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency was established in 1949 to address the 700,000 Palestinians who were displaced in 1948 during the creation of the State of Israel. And according to the UNHCR, in mid-2024, there were 122.6 million people who had been forcibly displaced. As of the beginning of 2024, 68.3 million were internally displaced, 37.9 million are refugees, 8 million are asylum seekers, and 5.8 million are people who are in need of international protection for other reasons, such as trafficking. And the data supporting these numbers come from three sources. And as statisticians, we should always be skeptical of these sources. So I think these are very approximate numbers. But there are annual surveys that are run by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. There's detailed data on Palestinian refugees from UNRWA. And of course, given the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank, it's a rapidly changing situation. And so all of these numbers are approximate. And finally, you have data from the European Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. As my students dug into the refugee camp management practices, they found that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has 6 handbooks related to refugee camp management. And some of them are a little contradictory. Several of them are vague. It's not a unified guidebook. There's the Emergency Handbook. There's the Integration Handbook for Resettled Refugees. There's a Needs Assessment Handbook. There's Procedures and Criteria for Determining Refugee Status Handbook. There's a Guidance on Protecting Internally Displaced People. And there's a Resettlement Handbook. And some of these clearly cover different but overlapping topics, and that makes it perhaps a little hard to apply the guidance that they want to provide. My students reviewed those, but there were clear problems. And in particular, if you're trying to manage a refugee camp, there are vast differences between refugees that are literate, educated, and have cell phones, and refugees that do not, such as the Sudanese refugees, the Darfurian refugees in Sudan and Chad. If you're running a refugee camp in which the people are literate and have cell phones, you can send a mass announcement to everybody's cell phone saying that there's going to be a dentist in the camp on Saturday, working from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And here's a sign-up sheet, a Google Doc that you can sign up for dental treatment. That's not possible if people do not have cell phones. My students actually interviewed 5 people who run refugee camps in Jordan. We tried for more, but we were not successful, uh, there's a lot of suspicion. And this is one of the ways in which I think the um, International Statistical Institute can be helpful. Uh, when an American professor reaches out to a camp manager in Jordan saying, I'd like to have a Zoom call to talk with you and ask you questions with my students about how you're managing your refugee camp, there's a lot of suspicion. Uh, People are very guarded. They're concerned that their funding might get cut. Uh, they, it's not a relationship of trust yet. Uh, Fortunately, I had uh, several of my students were Muslim and spoke the language and were able to connect better than I could. But the International Statistical Institute can contact the director of the Jordanian Census Bureau, who is a member of the ISI, and that director of the Jordanian Census Bureau can identify a Jordanian statistician who can then meet or Zoom with the director of a Jordanian refugee camp. And I think that the quality of the information would be enormously better if those relationships were managed by the ISI rather than from the UNHCR or from somebody in the United States. So our goal was to get basic information on the funding sources for a camp, the size of the camps, the history of the camp, the medical and public health needs that the camp had, and information about how education and security are managed. Uh, and we did that actually for a number of different countries. Uh, and the results are going to appear in a special issue of Chance, which is a publication of the American Statistical Association. That's going to come out later this year. It's going to be the last issue of Chance in 2025. Um, Obviously, some of these topics were very sensitive. Camp managers have constrained resources, and they are naturally reluctant to voice views that might undermine their support. We find that there were a wide range of opinion regarding the purposes of refugee camps. One community leader in the West Bank said, why do we need planning? We are refugee camps. Camps do not have playgrounds or parks. Those are things for cities. Do you want to turn our camp into a city? That was one viewpoint. Uh, Other camp managers are really basically trying to turn their camps into functioning cities. Uh, Most of the documents we read recognize the value of planning, but very few people are looking at camps statistically in order to determine best practices. And realistically, there is no one best practice. The best practice in Turkey is going to be different from the best practice in Chad. For example, consider the Darfurian refugees in Chad. About 500,000 were driven out of Sudan by the Janjaweed back in 2002. And then since the new war broke out in Sudan in 2023, uh, another 600,000 people have joined them. They're fleeing the rapid support forces who are armed by Russia's Wagners. The refugee population in Sudan is more than 1 million now. And as a reference, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The Sudanese refugees in Chad are now more than 1 million, and the population of Chad is 18 million. So that represents a very substantial fraction of the population of that country. The UNHCR has primary responsibility for supporting 12 Chadian refugee camps, and it draws some resources from the European Union, non-governmental organizations, and other donors. And the UNHCR says the Sudanese situation is currently the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And the Deputy High Commissioner visited West Darfur and Chad in early November of last year. Obviously, with the Trump administration coming in January, that situation has deteriorated and funding has dried up. Regarding camp management, it's notoriously poor. Over the last 22 years, very little has improved. A major obstacle is that the roads are so bad that it is nearly impossible to bring in supply trucks during the rainy season. And that's also an area where we're going to expect very high temperatures and water scarcity. Another issue is medical needs. New arrivals in the Judean camps have been psychologically traumatized and often physically damaged. Most refugees are women. The men and the boys are routinely killed by the Rapid Support Force. There are virtually no schools. There are too few teachers, and makeshift classrooms often have no water, which is a problem. The offboarding process is almost non-existent. Record acquisition during onboarding is unsystematic. Traumatized people just arrive at the camp. They walk across an unguarded border and arrive at the camp, and they need help. Uh, the one plus to this is that Chad has essentially no governance of the refugee camps. So if a person in a refugee camp in Chad decides to walk a rather long way to some other village, there's no law to stop them. And once they arrive in that village, they can set up practice as a shop owner or a blacksmith or whatever they're able to do uh, without any regulation preventing them. Uh, Here is one of the 12 tent cities in Chad, and the situation is deteriorating even further than when my students were doing the study last year. Uh, One can contrast the situations of the Sudanese refugees in Chad with the mostly Syrian refugees in Greece. Greece has been criticized for a number of inhumane practices that are probably illegal under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Uh, in 2016, it closed its borders to refugees arriving from Turkey, and it used its military to enforce that. Uh, and Greek courts have held that Turkey is sufficiently safe for refugees. The European Union has paid Turkey to help in keeping the Syrian refugees out of Europe, although actually technically Turkey is part of Europe. Uh, but it has promised a large sum of money and paid a portion of that to Turkey to maintain the Syrian refugees in Turkey. In 2024, there were 214,574 refugees in Greece, along with 20,887 asylum seekers and 2,427 others of concern. And those numbers are really solid because the Greek bureaucracy is doing a very good job of collecting information on the refugees who have managed to arrive in Greece. There are 32 refugee camps in mainland Greece, and all the onboarding occurs in two closed controlled access centers on the islands of Lesbos and Samos. So the situation in Chad is completely chaotic. Any data gathered is going to be very unreliable. It's very resource uh, it has far too few resources. Greece is much better resourced. They have good statistics. The data that we gather there are probably very, very accurate. The CCAS sounds sinister, but they have enormous value for camp management. The Greek administrators have standardized questionnaires that are processed in a central server, and so we have much better knowledge about the medical and educational needs of the refugees than we do for Chad. And we can connect Syrian refugees in Greece with family members who are living elsewhere in the world. And that's a way of offboarding these refugees to permanent residency somewhere else. The European Union mostly supports the refugee camps in Greece, and so they have better resources. There's still concerns with overcrowding and sanitation. Greek police provide security to the camp, in contrast to Chad, where the United Nations Police and the Détachement Intégré de Sécurité are responsible for security, and those work less well. Uh, Gosh, somebody is drawing in blue on things. Okay, well, all right. The Syrian refugees in Greece are far more educated than Darfurian refugees in Chad. Greece requires that all the children attend school, and it has programs that integrate refugee children into the local Greek schools. Uh, Syrian refugees in Greece may work for pay if they are granted refugee status. They may even open their own businesses with the same rights and obligations as Greek citizens. So there is a path to assimilation. Uh, but they must inform the asylum service if they get a job in order to maintain access to various benefits like cash assistance. Uh, Refugees in Chad are allowed to work for pay, but the economy is very different there, and the economic opportunities are few. Uh, Before 2022, the SDA program in Greece allowed refugees to find alternative shelter outside of camps. That was repealed, and now many refugees had to return to camps. The situation in Turkey is different. Turkey is not a full signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees. It is obliged to honor refugee status only for Europeans, but not for non-Europeans. There are about 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Most are called guests, and about 5% of them live in guest camps, which are essentially refugee camps. Uh, Most Syrians in Turkey are technically not permitted to work. There are exceptions for certain professions, such as medical doctors, uh, but there is a very active black market for labor. And so many Syrian refugees are uh, doing work which perturbs the economy of Turkey because they are taking jobs that presumably Turkish citizens would otherwise work, and they're being paid less. Turkey's temporary protection regulation grants Syrian refugees access to basic services, including education and health care, but it requires them to live in the province in which they were first registered. And Turkey is deliberately avoiding long-term commitments to refugees, and sometimes it forcibly returns refugees to Syria. In Turkey, security in camps is provided by the Turkish police. Lebanon is another center for Syrian refugees, and it faces special challenges. Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. 1 out of every 5 people living in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee, which puts enormous stress on the infrastructure of the Lebanese government. The Lebanese economy is in total shambles. It's on its knees. As of January 2023, a person could not withdraw more than $1,600 a month from their bank accounts, and I'm told that that ceiling has gotten even lower. The Lebanese government is entirely ineffectual. Nobody trusts it. It was incredibly corrupt. It siphoned off huge amounts of money from the Syrian people, and Hezbollah is the de facto government in Lebanon. And if you've been following the news, you know that Hezbollah is also significantly challenged by its contretemps with Israel. In 2020, Lebanon accidentally blew up their primary harbor, which was a disaster. And basically anybody in Lebanon who has education, who has skill, who has relatives living abroad, who has money, has left. So that is putting an enormous strain on how the government operates, and in particular, the refugees are being severely disadvantaged in Lebanon. The United Nations and the Gulf Cooperation Council fund Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon. The GCC consists of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And in contrast, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are mostly funded by UNRWA. I will mention that these wealthy Arab nations are contributing to the Gulf Cooperation Council in order to support their Muslim brothers who are refugees, but also keep them out of their own countries. They want the camps to be in places like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. They do not want to have refugee camps in, say, Saudi Arabia. Syrians who entered Lebanon after April 24th, 2019, through an unofficial border are subject to deportation. The government suspended the registration of Syrian refugees in 2015. The UNHCR wants registration to resume, since that gives the refugees access to medical services, schools, and employment. But so far, that has not happened. Some cities have discriminatory curfews against Syrian refugees. The Lebanese General Security has warned Lebanese citizens against sheltering refugees without residency documentation. which seems pretty harsh. And Syrian refugees in Lebanon have very limited legal status and few rights. The Asylum Committee basically determines their fate, and there's no recourse. Like Lebanon, Jordan has both Syrian and Palestinian refugees, and they are treated quite differently. Most Palestinian refugees have Jordanian citizenship. Most Syrian refugees do not. So the Syrian refugees have fewer rights and less access to employment, healthcare, and education. The Palestinian refugees mostly arrived after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Syrian refugees mostly arrived during the Syrian Civil War in 2011. The Palestinian refugees reside in camps managed by UNRWA. They can leave the camp freely and work, but they prefer to live with their families in the camps that were established by their grandparents. Syrian refugees are also housed in camps, but many also live in urban areas, and Syrian camps are largely supported by the UNHCR and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperating Commission. Both groups have more poverty than are typical for Jordanian citizens, so you're disadvantaged if you're a refugee from either Syria or Palestine in Jordan. Here you see where the Palestinian refugees have located, a lot in Jordan, a lot in Gaza. Then you have significant numbers in West Bank and Syria and Lebanon. These numbers are out of date. The situation in Gaza is monstrous. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I don't see a future in which all of Gaza does not become a huge refugee camp. And so I would like people to start planning for that now. And that's one of the things I want the International Statistical Institute to start thinking about. It's not too early to have a conference on how to best manage a huge refugee camp like Gaza. Thank you. As of late 2023, Iraq hosts more than 300,000 refugees and asylum seekers. About 90% of these are Syrian, and they primarily live in Kurdistan. There are many are in refugee camps. There's limited integration, and Iraq has major concerns about security. Additionally, there are more than 1 million internally displaced Iraqis, and that's a result of the U.S. occupation, ISIS, and the decimation and destruction of infrastructure in Iraq. The UNHCR supports refugees and internally displaced people by providing protection, assistance, and advocating for their needs. So what can statisticians do? Refugee camp management is a multidisciplinary problem. It involves sociological aspects, it involves economic aspects, it involves a whole medical stuff, a whole lot of skills that are not within our ambit. Nonetheless, I do see ways in which we can contribute. Refugee camp managers need official statistics of the kinds that are produced by, or that are needed by census bureaus, public health offices, and urban planners. You need to know how many people are in the camp. You need to know what their age and gender mix is. You need to understand what their medical requirements are. Those are all important things. One would like to have metrics for education, security, income, and mental health. I am very concerned that the Sudanese refugees are in what we would call a triage flip situation. The UNHCR identified the Sudanese refugees as the most vulnerable, the most damaged of the refugee communities in the world back before Donald Trump was elected as president of the United States. Since his election, USAID funding has been cut. The US is basically giving no money to the UNHCR and very little money to the UN. So the UNHCR is now trying to provide support to the Sudanese refugees with vastly limited resources. And the triage flip refers to what happens in an emergency department. If you go to a hospital, the usual rule is that the person who is most sick gets care first. But if there is a 20-car collision on the interstate and a whole batch of people all arrive at the emergency department at the same time, they have what is called a triage flip. It may be the sickest person could be saved if a surgeon performed 5 hours worth of surgery on them. But using that surgeon for 5 hours means that other people who could have been saved are going to die. And so instead of treating the sickest person first, you try and maximize the number of people you save. And I'm very worried that the UNHCR may be forced to conclude that it just cannot help the Sudanese people with the resources it now has. It's going to have to divert its resources to places where it can make a difference, say in Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey. Econometrics. The current financing system does not seem sustainable, and the burden is only going to grow as the climate change forces more and more people to displace. We need spatiotemporal models for climate change, but it looks like parts of North Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia are not going to be habitable in the way that they are now. Statisticians can study supply chain management, and that enables predictive inference and measures of robustness. You'd like to know how much redundancy you need in the supply chain to ensure that you don't run out of water in a Chadian camp. And finally, statisticians, some of us, work on agent-based models for population movement, and that seems like another area in which we can contribute. One would like to make quantified statements of uncertainty about how many people are going to be relocating from, say, Bangladesh into Pakistan, and what will be the resourcing needs for those displaced people, and how will those funds be raised. That's the end of my talk. And I ran 1 minute over time. I apologize.